Alright, I'm going to try to make this a fairly short little tutorial, but I'd seen a post on the forums where somebody was looking for some kind of trailing effect like this, and you can notice it's two separate materials, and they kind of swell up and then fade out, and then wherever I'm standing still, they it just stays there. So it's actually not that hard to pull this off, and the first thing I'm going to do is show you a decal. A deferred decal. So a couple of things you got to note when working with these is that they have weird units in them, and that's because if you look, you see the purple arrow. The whole thing's technically rotated, and so the axes that you work with are kind of wrong. Like if you notice, it's 128, 256, 256, and so the x-axis on it becomes like the z-axis essentially because of the rotation. So you can apply materials to them, and just using the one that I made, you'll see that it works pretty well. So the material is pretty straightforward. It's actually really simple. I can't preview it because it's a decal mode, but in the actual material, you're going to want to come in, you're going to want to change it to deferred decal. It's got to be on translucent. And then down here I put it on the debuffer because when I didn't want it to actually be translucent, like I wanted it to completely overlay. So I set it to this mode. It seemed to work, but it gives me color, normal, and roughness. And in my case, I want the normal map, and I want to have some roughness control. So you're making a sphere gradient. It's really simple. You can preview this if it doesn't kill my computer. I'd have to open this in another material. Actually, I made one. Sorry. So you're making a sphere gradient, and this power node just kind of controls how hard or soft that edge is. So if this is 8, it's going to be really smooth, and then you're multiplying that against your texture sample. So let me get to the real material here, because what we want is a world aligned texture. And the reason for that is because if you spawn a bunch of these little decals, they're going to be all every which way, and you're going to have a lot of weird artifacts as they overlap near each other. So if you make them all world aligned, it kind of gives them all one big giant texture to tile across. And this texture size you can kind of view as like the size of it in 3D space, and you can kind of use this to like the equivalent of tiling essentially. If you set this to half, it's going to be half in the game, like half the resolution. I'll show it later. So you use a world aligned texture on a texture object. You can create, let's say you dragged in a random material. Let me just grab in a diffuse material here. Keep on going to the wrong one. Okay, so if you drag in a regular texture sample, this will not connect. You need a texture object, and the way you can get that real quick is if you dragged in a sample, you can just right click here, hit copy, and then make a texture object, and then just paste it in there. And a lot of times it'll just create it already because you have it selected or something, but in case you ever need to make one, that's the quick way to do it. So they already kind of get their own world position and all that. You don't really have to worry about these other settings. You do need to use a world aligned normal though instead of texture, and just put your normal in there, and that's just kind of the special one you use for normal maps, because normal maps go from but technically internally -1 to 1, and there's a little bit different math involved between these two nodes, I believe. I haven't checked, but I would assume. So you take your sphere gradient and you're going to multiply it against these two, and that's going to essentially mask out what you want and don't want. So if something is black on the gradient, that's going to be a 0. 0 times anything is going to give you a 0, and so on and so forth. So that's one way you can mask between them. And then you just set a roughness here. And if you wanted to, you could do world position offset, but I'm not doing it here. So once you have that, it's done. Again, just make sure that your material is set correctly here, or else it will not work. So now this part here is probably going to take maybe another video to fully explain it out, but I'll go over the brief overview right now what's happening. At the beginning of the gameplay, this is on the level, by the way, the actual level blueprint. You could do this elsewhere. You could do it on the player. You could do it on whatever. I just did it on the blueprint, level blueprint, because it just was easier for me to work with. I didn't feel like messing around in my massive blueprint for the player character. So, hang on one second. So the basic gist is when we first spawn into the game, we're going to do a line trace from the player's feet down, or from the player's root down to the floor. We're looking for a static mesh, world static, and then we're going to spawn one of these decals on there. And we're going to give it some basic settings like the size and all that. And then what we're going to do is every so many units, I'll explain all this like I said in another video, but every so many units we're going to spawn another one, and then we're going to do some math on it to handle the scaling and upscaling. So we'll essentially keep some arrays of different things that we need to know. I technically don't need this. Originally I was doing this using splines, and then I kind of figured, don't really need it. If I go to switch it to a render target method, which is what I plan on doing eventually, just kind of making one big giant decal that's going to draw from render target with a world aligned texture internally to it, not in the render target but in the decal. It'll allow you to kind of create holes and all that, and it'll just be for the cost of the one. You'll only be paying the rendering cost really for the one decal. I mean, there's going to be some overhead for the render target and all of that, because essentially you're going to end up with a bunch of points, and then you're going to have to go into a material and you're going to have to like draw a sphere or something, like one of those little 2D spheres for each point inside of an array like this. You'll have to go through and kind of dot the whole thing up, and then maybe do some kind of smoothing blend to the curve, and then from there it would get pushed into the decal and update. But I've got to play around with them. I haven't really messed around too much with render targets yet, but you know, I'm pretty quick at learning things, so usually, knock on wood. But yeah, it's gonna handle scaling and upscaling, downscaling, and all that of the little decals, and then it's gonna remove them when they're done. The only thing that it's gonna really check to make sure of is that it doesn't remove the only decal. If there's only one, that'll be the one that's constantly under the player's feet. So there will always be at least one of them in the world, but I'm going to cut this video because this is a trial version of Bandicam, and it's 10 minutes is almost up, so I'll have to make a second video. So look forward to it or whatever.